Okay. Great. I think we are recording now. If you're joining now, you should be alerted to that as well. So if you have to leave early, if you can't stay for the whole presentation, we're happy to share it with you as a video after the fact. We'll be using it that way. Welcome to everybody who's here. We're really grateful that you've made time in your evening to see us. I know that it can be a long day, and we really just appreciate that you've made time to talk to us tonight. We're going to be talking about AP classes, AP exams, and some of the ways that students can get ready for those things. And we also really are thankful that when you registered for this event, you gave us your questions. We've been able to incorporate a lot of those into the presentation, and some of them we've saved for the end if they didn't quite fit into the sort of broad strokes things that we're going to talk about today. And if there were questions that were really specific, we might not be able to get to them in the presentation, but we will be reaching out to you to whatever contact info you left for us so that we can help have a conversation about your question. So again, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you. I wanted to start by just introducing the three of us and what we do at AJ Tutoring. Ben, do you want to tell us who you are real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Ben Fishberg-Copeland. I am the Lafayette Office Director. I also tutor math and physics, including the AP Calculus and AP Physics 1, 2, and C tests. I also tutor SAT and ACT. And I'm really excited to be here and talk with you about the AP tests.
Excellent. My name is Jessica Embry. I'm the Academic Director at AJ Tutoring. I've been here for many years at this point. I started off as an SAT tutor, which I still do, but I've also been tutoring math from K through calculus. And I have AP Calculus students right now too, which I'm excited to work with this spring.
And I'm Matt Downhour. I'm the Director of Online Tutoring. So I started working at AJ in Redwood City or Menlo Park, but since taking over our online operations, I tutor all of the histories and then econ and government and geography and art history. So it's more of the social sciences half of the AP curriculum.
Yeah. So, if you're coming in with thoughts on the humanities side, Matt's going to be the person to ask. And if you've got ideas about, STEM courses, we've got Ben here to help provide some perspective on that as well. All right. But first, before we start that, let me kind of lay out what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what AP courses are and AP exams, how they're used, what their benefits are, how colleges might view them, how students might view them, and give you kind of a broad overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about APs. After that, we're going to go a little bit into more detail about how students can prepare for AP exams. Most of our students are at least halfway through an AP course at this point, and we will talk a little bit about what are some good strategies for preparing during an AP course to get good grades and to really understand the material. But we're going to mostly focus now on AP exams since we're recommending, and this is a little bit of a preview, that students start, excuse me, my computer just did something, apologies. We're recommending that students start prepping pretty soon. So let's go ahead and get started with what AP courses are. AP courses are college level courses that students complete in high school. So what that means is that the student isn't getting college credit for this, they're getting high school credit. But the course itself is considered difficult enough to be college level in most cases. We'll talk a little bit about how colleges actually interpret that, but that is the intention behind an AP class, is that you are getting the opportunity to take a college level course in high school, and it goes on your high school transcript. Because of that, AP courses tend to require much more time for homework and studying than typical high school courses. There are some high school courses that take a lot of time, but AP courses you should expect to take more, just like a college course would. This is partly why we sometimes worry a little bit about students who are taking a full slate of APs, like 5 to 6 APs, because they do need to do a lot of extra work outside. It's always possible, but it's definitely something to keep in mind when you're trying to decide how many APs to take in a year. Like honors courses, AP courses are weighted. So when you get a grade in an AP course, in most cases, every school is a little bit different. The course grade is weighted. So if you get a B in the course, it counts as a 4.0, or an A would count as a 5.0, that kind of thing. And college counselors tend to recommend that when you select your AP courses, that you select what will match well with what you're interested in pursuing in college. That doesn't mean you can't take AP courses that are sort of on the sidelines of that, but it does mean that if you're planning to be like a pre-med major in college, you may not want to avoid AP Bio and AP Chemistry. You may want to consider taking some STEM courses in AP or taking a math course. It doesn't mean that you couldn't also take an AP Psychology course or an AP English course, but these should be courses that you're willing to spend as a student a lot of time in both in your homework and in your courses. AP exams are the culminating exams or project in some cases that are submitted in May at the end of the school year. So as students work through an AP course, they are getting grades. They also can take an AP exam that is then scored and used to award college credit in some cases. So we'll talk kind of about that in a little bit. Most exams include a multiple choice section and a free response section. Those are often equally weighted, although every exam is a little bit different. If you're taking, the AP Music Theory exam, you're going to have to do a sight reading element where you have to sing the right notes. If you're taking one of the world languages, you have to be able to correctly interpret what you're listening to and speak and write. So some of the exams have more elements to them. If you're taking, AP Art and Design, you're not actually doing an exam, you're submitting a portfolio. So that's one of the cases where you don't have an exam. Most of the time you do have an exam, and it's usually multiple choice and free response. Exams are scored on a scale of 1 to 5. And so a 5 might, in some cases, like I know for calculus, a 5 means that you got probably about 70% of the questions right. And that's considered the highest score you can get. In some cases, that number is higher. In some cases, it's lower. It depends on the difficulty of the test and how much people tend to pass it. A 3 is considered a passing score, but that can depend also on the way that the college that you attend interprets it. So even though the College Board, who does the AP, will tell you that a 3 is considered a passing, the college that you attend may interpret that differently. Students who earn high marks on their exams may earn college credit for their scores. So some colleges will say that a 3 is enough as a pass, and that gives college credit. Some schools will say you need a 4 or 5. There are ways to look this up by going into the College Board and actually looking at the different schools and what they tend to award for different grades. So that's one way for you to kind of tell what is a quote unquote good score on an AP exam. Some of them won't award subject specific credit. So let's say you get a 5 on an AP calculus exam. Some schools will say that counts as credit towards math, and some schools will say that counts as credit towards general education requirements. And so you don't actually get a math credit for it, but you do get credit towards graduation in college. And sharing AP scores is optional. I think this is really important. I've talked to a lot of students over the past several years that have talked to me about, should I even take the AP exam? Does it count for anything? Does it matter? Is it a bad idea if I think I won't do well? I think that tends to be the biggest concern. If I'm worried that I'm not going to get a 5, should I just skip it? And first of all, a 5 is not the only good score on the AP, but also you don't have to share your score if it doesn't turn out the way that you hope it will. So if you don't take the exam, no matter what, there will be no score to share. If you do take the exam and you have a bad day and it doesn't go as well as you hoped, you can withhold that score from most colleges. There's like a very small selection of top tier schools that will ask you to follow on the honor system to submit all AP scores. They cannot actually tell, but they will say, please sign this saying that you've actually given us all your AP scores. So a lot of the risk involved in taking an AP, if you're feeling nervous about how you'll score, is actually taken away by this. Like you don't have to submit all scores to colleges. There are a lot of AP courses being offered. We've added some new ones. So this year, AP Pre-Calculus has been added. That's new this year. Next year, there's going to be AP African American Studies. Some of these AP courses are now going to be moving into digital only testing. None of that is true this year, but there are a handful of AP courses that are experimenting with digital testing in the same way that SAT is now moved into digital testing. They're both College Boards, so that makes sense. And all of these, I know it's really difficult to see this probably, but all of these these APs with asterisks are APs that we have helped students prepare for. So we are fairly well versed in the AP at AJ Tutoring, and so if you have any questions about it, we can help. The world languages, it can depend. So it depends on who we have on staff at the moment, but we actually, I believe, have done AP Italian and AP Japanese. We just don't have anybody on staff right now who can do it. So it's a broad spectrum of classes. I've grouped them here in terms of arts and literature, social sciences, STEM courses, and world languages. So they're covering a broad swath of what I would call sort of like first-year college courses. So colleges, I've kind of touched on this a little bit. How do colleges view AP courses? The course itself is kind of viewed differently from the exam, and I think that's important to note because some students won't take the exam and because some students won't take exams until after they've already been admitted to colleges, and so they can't necessarily use exams for everything. So no matter what, taking AP courses is helpful for getting a more supportive learning environment. This is, I think, one of the biggest educational benefits to students is that they get to take a college level course, but the number of hours that the teacher invests in them is much higher than a typical college course. In a typical college course, you might see the teacher, for a couple of hours a week, and then most of the time you have to spend outside in tutorials, with a TA, with your friends, whatever you can do to try to make up the difference in what you understand. In an AP course in high school, you're of course in school a lot longer, and there's a lot more resources available with high school teachers typically. So in general, you do just get more hours with somebody, with your teacher, than you would in a college environment. That doesn't mean that you're going to be off the hook for taking those courses in college. I think in a lot of cases, it's actually better to take it again in college, having already experienced it in high school and having a good understanding of what you're going to see. That can make your first year of college a little bit easier. And just because you have so much background information from the course you took in high school. I do see this as a pretty huge benefit. The students that I have in AP Calculus who then take calculus in college feel a lot stronger in that initial college calculus course than they would have if they hadn't taken it at all. So to that end, it introduces college level course rigor. If you've seen AP classes, if you've been in AP classes, then the transition from high school to college is a little bit less intense. You have an understanding of what is expected. You've started to develop study skills and homework expectations that align better with what you'll see in college. I think it's really useful for students to take at least one AP course before they enter college fully as a full-time student. Or advanced course that is similar. And we'll talk a little bit about, how some schools actually aren't offering APs or are starting to pull back on AP courses, and that doesn't mean that they're pulling back on rigor. It also demonstrates student interest and capability. So if I, again, am hoping to, join a college in a pre-med major, then I may want to demonstrate that by showing that I took AP biology and I took AP chemistry and I did really well because I worked really hard. And one way to show that you did really well is to get a good grade in that course. So the grade is really important in an AP course. It's one of the most important parts of a college application at this point. The AP exam, though, is starting to become potentially a little bit more important to applications than it used to be. In the past, AP exams were not intended to be useful in college applications. They were only intended to be used as a way of measuring the sort of in a standard way how you did in the course, what your understanding is, and whether that would then translate into college credit at your institution that you attend. Now it does a little bit more. It indicates student achievement to colleges in a way that they don't have in a lot of cases. So because so many colleges have gone either test optional or test blind, they're missing some standardized testing opportunities with students. And that can make it difficult to interpret whether a student is actually demonstrating their understanding or not. Grade inflation is a factor that has come into play. And there have been at least I talked to one of our college counselors on staff, and she said that she had recently read that Emory University was starting to use AP exams as an indicator of student achievement in college admissions and not just after college admissions. So I suspect that this is something that may be a little bit more widespread than is publicized. I don't know if it will last forever. We'll see what happens with other standardized testing. But for now, this is one of the few standardized tests that schools are actually using. As I said before, though, a lot of AP exams don't get taken until after you've already been admitted to college. If you're taking most of your AP courses as a senior, you won't get your AP exam scores until after graduation. And by then you may have already been admitted to a college. Those are then sent to the college so that you can get course credit for that. And that kind of leads me into that second bullet point there. If you have college credit because you took AP courses and AP exams in particular, which are the only way that they actually award college credit, an A in the course is not sufficient. You also have to have a score on the test that correlates with what the college will take. That can help you graduate in 4 years. So you get to enter college already having college credit. Makes it a little bit easier to take maybe either a less full-time schedule so that you can get, kind of adjusted to college, or have just a little bit more wiggle room in terms of meeting all of those college graduation requirements in 4 years. Another way that it helps is it can afford students priority course registration. So some very impacted classes at institutions may not even allow freshmen or first year students to enroll because they don't have the capacity for that, and they have to only start at second year students. If you have enough AP credit to sort of show that you have sophomore standing, that's one of the ways that we can say that, then you can get a slightly higher on the list for registering for classes. So in certain cases, that can be really important. It's not going to be important at every institution, but in big institutions with highly impacted classes, maybe like an intro to chemistry class or something that a lot of students want to enroll in, it can give you a little bit of an edge as a student. All right. Enough from me. So that's a lot about APs, and maybe some of this is stuff that you already knew. If you're new to APs, I hope that was a helpful primer for you. But I would love to get a little bit more into how we actually prepare students for exams and how students at home can just prepare for exams even without us. There's a lot of really useful things that we've developed over the years that we would like to be able to share with you tonight. So I'm going to pass it over to Ben and Matt. I think they're going to tag team this section and just to talk a little bit about what is the timeline for preparing for an AP exam.
Okay, so for a student who is currently taking an AP class, honestly, the best time to start thinking about the exam is right around now. It's far enough away that there's plenty of time to make a plan, to implement a plan, to adjust it as needed. But you also are far enough along that you already have a pretty good sense of where you're at and what you want to aim for. So in February, the big goal is to identify how far along you are in the class. Some classes will have covered the majority of the material by now. Many classes actually will spend almost all of April doing their own test preparation. Some will be going right up to the wire and will be finishing like early May for a test that's in the second week of May. And so knowing where your particular class is at can help you decide how much additional practice you want to be doing in order to make sure that you do well in the exam. Another thing that's important at this point is to look back over past material, particularly stuff in the first semester, and make sure that it's all clear, make sure that it's all well understood. Material in the AP exams covers everything that's been covered in the class. You're as likely to see something that was taught in September as you are to see something that was taught in March. And honestly, a lot of the time, students do great on the stuff that's very fresh in their minds, and they get really tripped up on stuff that they haven't really dug into in the past 6 months. So once you have a sense of what you want to aim for, like where you're at, where you want to go, then you really want to plan out the next 2 months. You want to set aside, make sure you can actually set aside enough time in March and in April to continue to stay on top of the class, but to do the extra work needed to align your understanding with the format of the test and to make sure that everything is fresh when you get into May and actually take the tests. In general, this process in February, like per class, it only takes maybe 2 hours if you're feeling really on top of things, if you're in the flow, maybe a little bit more if your class is coming at things in a slightly unusual way. Definitely more if you took the class in the past or taking the AP without taking the class that it aligns with. So going into March is when you start to really implement the plan. So things that you want to make sure that you have done in March is you want to familiarize yourself with the format of the test. So the AP test has very specific ways of presenting information, of presenting questions. The multiple choice and the free response questions have their own strong patterns. Some academic classes dig into these in detail, others don't. Others choose to focus on other things as a priority. And if yours is prioritizing this, you probably already have a sense of this. You've probably done problems in this format. But a lot of really great classes choose to prioritize other learning objectives, in which case you want to make sure that you're doing some extra work to make sure you understand the material in the way that the AP test is presented. Ways to do this is to look at available resources. The College Board presents a lot of available resources, both online and in released materials that you can, I think, purchase. We also, of course, we provide our own. And then as you're doing those problems, as you're digging into them, you really want to focus on patterns. Once you've done, 3 or 4 of these, you're going to notice that they're basically the same thing every time. And that feeling of honestly sort of knowing what to expect, of almost being a little bit bored at that point because you've done this already and you just do the same thing again, is really the feeling that you want to aspire to, because these tests can be pretty high stakes, and having that level of familiarity can really help with the stress around taking the tests, in that moment in May. So for March, that's probably 4 hours if your class is super aligned with AP practices, and 16 if it's not particularly, or if you're struggling in the class, and of course more if you're not taking the class. And then finally, April is where we really want to double down and be focusing pretty much entirely on AP materials. Hopefully the class finishes new material late March or early April, so that it's going to pivot and do its own review as well. This is where, in addition to familiarity with format, familiarity with content, we also just want to be familiar with the experience of taking these marathon tests, managing energy levels, taking full practice tests, practicing timing, and honestly a little bit of triage, deciding what types of questions are questions that you can get easily and that you want to make sure that you do all of, and then leave the harder ones for you alone for later, for whatever time you have left. That type of decision making is mostly for April, when at this point you have all the content, you are familiar with the patterns, and you want to just focus on optimizing your own approach to the test. This can take a lot of extra time in addition to class time. Again, if your class is really focusing on its own on this, honestly, 8 hours might be enough in addition to what the class itself is assigning. But this can, get to a lot more than that, 24 hours or more of your time in addition to class time. To make sure that everything comes together and you feel confident that you're going to get the score that you want. The AP tests have pretty broad ranges for each of their scores. A 5, a 70% or higher is often a 5 for some classes, for some AP tests. As low as a 60% can be a 5. If you want to get a 5, you should be confident that you're going to get like 10% higher than the cutoff, so that even if things go a little bit sideways, you still have a nice buffer to make sure that it still comes together.
Great. And so if you're following along and sort of adding up the hours, as I did with Ben's guidelines, you'll notice that if you're doing 44 hours per test and you're taking 5 or 6 tests, that's basically your student taking on a new full-time job, which isn't necessarily practical for everybody. So if you're prepping for multiple exams, there's a couple sort of tips here that you want to keep in mind, right? If you're tutoring with us or studying on your own, there's a hard limit usually to how much time you have. So learning how to prioritize is going to be really helpful. So based on your class grades and based on a diagnostic test, that's the first way that you want to look at how am I going to prioritize my time? What subjects need to be focused on? Which ones am I already fine? And many students will find that, you're going to be on the low end of that prep for some topics, and that is going to free up time for the higher end for a couple other subjects. But also, students want to look at what are their school's policies, which tests are going to be most valuable. Something to keep in mind, for example, if you're looking at a UC, and a high AP English test score can allow you to meet their entry-level writing requirement, which normally you'd otherwise have to do with an entrance exam. So maybe that's really important to you, or maybe it's not. And so looking at different schools and their policies is going to help you decide, okay, which tests are really top priority for me here. And then if you are working with us, the nice thing is that if you have 6 different tests, probably, can't guarantee this, but it probably means you don't have exactly 6 different tutors. A lot of tutors are going to tutor more than one thing, and that can give you a bit of flexibility as well. If I really need help in physics and calculus, well, a physics tutor likely is going to also be able to help with the calculus because they go kind of hand in hand there. So those are things to keep in mind, and especially why you want to start now, because if you have a lot of tests that you're looking at, determining your comfort level with each one, and then kind of prioritizing where you need to put that limited time is going to be really important.
All right. So I think one of the biggest things that it helps to actually do AP test prep tutoring is that we can help manage this process. We can help you decide how much time a given test is going to need. We can help scaffold that process to make sure that you're using the time effectively. We can usually build in some efficiencies so that instead of doing your own investigation of the repeated patterns, we can direct you to them and then help you reinforce them. And we can, right off the bat, ideally in February or in early March, give your student a diagnostic. Our diagnostics are designed to be shorter than the tests, but to give a good snapshot of the content in the test, to give you a sense of, if you just took it right now, where would you be? In general, we found actually that percentages in the diagnostics often line up pretty well with percentages in the test if a student just sort of took the test without doing any further prep. And so, if you take a diagnostic and get somewhere in the range that we would call a 3, we can make a recommendation for how many sessions and how much extra studying and how much extra prep to do. And if you take a diagnostic and you get somewhere that we would call a strong 5, we can give your student a high 5 and then maybe just do a little bit of fine tuning in April to make sure everything comes together, but also allow you to focus on other things and prioritize those. The diagnostics mostly cover the entire class. And so there are sometimes material that in February a student hasn't seen yet. However, an important thing to note is at this point, a student is probably somewhere in the 60 to 75% of the way through the material in the class. If they knew all of the material that they've learned so far extremely well, they could probably get a 5 just with what they know already. And so this is one of the big reasons why it's good to get started early in looking back and making sure that past material is strongly understood and well reinforced, because it can play a really big role in how a student does in the test. The material that's learned right before the test, in late March or in early April, that material is probably going to be pretty fresh regardless, and those are points the student is often going to get. It's really that past material that we want to make sure they're just as confident with, so that they can pick up the points, wherever they are, to hit that threshold for whatever score they're aiming for. So, depending on how the diagnostic goes, we might recommend just, 4 sessions, probably in April, maybe starting mid-March, so that it can be spread out easily, so that we can plan around breaks and other priorities. For each session, there's usually 1.5 to 3 hours of homework, which can sometimes include some full practice tests, because particularly right at the end, we want to make sure that we're getting in that experience of managing energy levels and managing time. The most important thing is that as the prep continues, we can adjust the plan based on how well things are coming together. If things are clicking really well, if the student just needed actually a little bit of a refresher and then everything's falling into place, we can spread things out, do fewer sessions so that the student can focus on other things. If we notice that like there was a major gap that we're going to really want to dig into because it's often tested in a serious way, or if there's several different parts of the test that rely on certain material if the student is struggling with, we can then spend extra time on that and make sure that we have time to refresh it so that by the time we are in April and we're just trying to, get that fine tuning in, there's no surprises. We all sort of know where things are at. We all know where we're going, and we all feel pretty confident about the results.
Great. And so, of course, it is generally the case that students are taking an AP class that they want to study and do well in, as well as taking the AP test. It's possible to do just one or the other, but usually you're doing both. And we help with both. But the approach to each one is a little bit different. So in classes, obviously there's multiple parts to the grade, right? So there's projects, there's homework, and then there's tests. And we can help with all that. Your students working on all of that this semester. And every class is a little bit different. As Ben alluded to, some teachers, what's important for them is precisely what's important on the test because that's sort of how they're chosen to align their class. Other teachers may have additional projects or topics that aren't emphasized on the test, but the teacher think are really important. And sometimes when students are taking their semester or their chapter tests, part of what's tested is stuff that's absolutely not going to be on the AP test, right? But it's supplementary stuff that they went over in class, things that the teacher felt was important or enrichment materials, which is great. And that's like more fun to help with because it's not the same thing. But when we shift gears to the test, that sort of is not, we're putting on our blinders and we're focused on what's going to be on the test. And when we're preparing for the AP exam, the content is super predictable. So the College Board has released a course description that usually they follow pretty closely. Like this is what we want students to learn in this course. There's flexibility for teachers, but there's also like pretty well defined what's going to be there. For, I believe, every test, I don't know, Ben, maybe physics or something weird, but there's many samples of the sort of questions that they're going to give, especially on the free response section. So we know roughly what gets tested and how it gets tested and really often how it's worded. So we can predict pretty well what students absolutely need to know for the test. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. So often we'll be helping the student kind of with both things, with their class and with their test. But it looks pretty different. And if you watch a session with us, or if you watch a student studying, you'd probably notice these differences. And then finally, by the time we get to the test, hopefully students have covered most of the material. There are exceptions. Ben makes it sound like math and physics classes are really on it. History classes, sometimes we're making a mad rush, and it's AP US history, and late April we're covering Watergate. So sometimes history classes do need to cover a bunch of material right at the end. But hopefully what we're doing for the exam is we're focusing on the skills that are being tested, right? So not necessarily the content, hopefully we've learned that, but we're practicing, okay, what is the rubric for our essays? What is the work we need to show for this kind of math problem? And are we just honing in on those skills more than just, having memorized a bunch of facts? And most tests have some combination of the two. But when we're looking at the AP exam, we find that the biggest score improvements come from improving those skills, not just repeating with our memorization. And so that's sort of how it will look different when we're preparing for the class as a whole versus when we're kind of laser focused on the test.
All right. So as Matt mentioned, the AP tests are very consistent. They're very predictable. And they have two major formats of questions that students experience really differently. We have our multiple choice questions, which are usually like a short prompt, given some information, and then pick from 4 or 5 choices of what you in a STEM course or you would calculate as the answer, or what short response would be the most correct response in the case of really any of the courses. Actually, you get a lot of qualitative questions in the STEM as well. And then on the other side, you have your free response questions, which are they're longer questions, they're written responses. You often have many parts that build on each other. And they are a very different format from the multiple choice. Different students do better in each section. Some students, they can see the multiple choice sort of as a game that they're just trying to beat. And in those situations, like, they can find the multiple choice is pretty fun, pretty easy to navigate. There are some very, very strong patterns in multiple choice questions that we will be focusing on in tutoring sessions. If those patterns click, multiple choice can be very nice. However, a lot of students get really, really tripped up by the multiple choice. The multiple choice questions often lean on misconceptions that students have. They often take things sort of one step farther back than students are used to starting, and get a little bit more abstract in a way that if a student hasn't practiced reading them carefully, making sure that they understand what's actually being asked as opposed to what they're used to being asked, and then making sure that they're identifying sort of traps in the various answers and ruling those out before making their own selection. A lot of students can really have a hard time on multiple choice tests. This is actually also the case just in regular academic tests. There are often students who struggle in multiple choice in a way that they don't at all when they're doing free response. So in order to help with that, we focus a lot on how to specifically engage with the multiple choice format. This is mostly just ways to drive process of elimination. There's a lot of little tricks that allow you to come at these problems sideways, that allow you to avoid the little traps that the College Board likes to set in its answers. Honestly, a lot of the time, there will be a wrong answer that is worded in an incredibly compelling way. And if a student doesn't have a process for identifying what is wrong about wrong answers, they're going to select that answer more often than not, because it just feels better. And then the right answer is going to be a little bit more vague, a little bit more abstract, a little bit trickier to feel confident about. If a student, again, doesn't have a process, they often accidentally just cross it off because they don't like it for some reason. And so we want to make sure that we're giving them strategies to avoid these traps. Now, on the free response side, the most important thing is that there are, I think, for almost every single test, dozens of released free response sections with scoring guidelines. And so what every student wants to make sure that they've done is tried many free response questions and then scored them. The College Board is very consistent. Every single grader grades based off of the given guidelines. They want to make sure that, despite the fact that hundreds of different people are grading these tests, it doesn't matter who's grading the test. Any students who did the same work would get the same score. That's something that we can leverage. The College Board, in its grading guidelines, actually really emphasizes what it cares about. And again, there are strong patterns. In calculus, you basically see the same 5 free response questions every single year. And so once you have done a few of them, you know exactly how to approach each one. And not just how to approach it, but how to make sure that you write the things that the graders are being told to look for. And that is especially important. There's a bit of a box checking exercise, honestly, when answering free response questions, to just make sure that you have covered your bases and done the things that count as a complete answer to get you full credit in the free response. Partial credit is possible in free response, which is also nice. A lot of students appreciate that. The one major danger I would say about free response is that it's very easy to get lost in the weeds. And so time management does become especially important, and a certain amount of intentionally choosing the order in which you do the free response questions is also quite important. And so that's another thing that we want to make sure that we're coaching students on. Back to multiple choice just for a moment. A downside of the multiple choice questions is that there are not nearly as many released multiple choice questions as there are released free response questions. And so when practicing multiple choice, we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of all the resources available. We've generated a large number of multiple choice questions for the AP tests that we use in our practice materials to make sure that students get the practice in and looking at for the various patterns, identifying what's being tested and how to go about answering it. We also will be coaching our students on making sure that they have access to all of the materials that are provided by the College Board. There's a lot of materials on the AP website that are only accessible if a teacher unlocks them. And sometimes we want to coach our students to just gently harass their teachers to make those available so that they have all of the practice materials possible. All right.
Yeah, exactly what Ben was saying. So as far as we're strategizing, yeah, the first place we want to start really is with what the College Board has released, right? That's the gold standard, so to speak. And almost always, we're going to be looking with a student at those gradings, like the grading strategies, the way the FRQs are graded. I usually make my students grade their own and then compare them to the grading standards and just see how they did, but how well they understand the rubric as well, right? So that's where we usually start, I think, is with these College Board materials. Look at those FRQs and also look at the course description, right? Like I said, this isn't a secret. The College Board really wants you to know what they want you to know, so that you're not confused, you're not saying the wrong thing. But it takes a little bit to find the right materials and prioritize them. And I think anybody who spent a lot of time on College Board created websites knows that it's not easy to find the things that you want all the time. So we can also help students kind of wade through that and find the College Board materials. But once we've gotten sort of an idea of the flavor of the test, what the questions look like, we have specific types. Every test has types of questions. And for basically every question type, we have some strategies for it. So we're helping students try to identify, okay, what kind of question am I looking at? Can I sort of put this in a box so I can understand it and not be so intimidated by it? And see that, okay, I've never seen this question, but it's not entirely new to me either. And then we want to help build up sort of a student toolbox to how do I deal with these different kinds of questions? As students are studying on their own, they should really try to think about it that way as well, right? It's sort of empowering to think, I have various tools, I have various approaches available to me, and I don't use the same approach on every question, but I'm in charge here. And if they're working with us, we have some sort of targeted practice for most of the kinds of questions. So if I have a history student who's always struggling with questions that deal with a certain kind of primary source or a certain kind of like table or graph, I have a worksheet that I can walk through with them and say, you have a table or a graph that you have to analyze. Let's talk about specific strategies for data analysis on this kind of question. And we have that for a lot of our tests. And students really benefit from that, from seeing the questions not just as like a sea of 50 random encounters with different question types, but instead there's certain categories of questions they'll encounter and a strategy for each one. So that's sort of the middle, I would say the middle section of a preparation is working through those, and of course prioritizing them, finding out which ones are most challenging, which ones we sort of already have in the bag. And then once we feel pretty confident about both the material and the questions generally, there's also whole test strategies. So there's things that you can really only practice sitting down and taking an entire test. This is an ordeal. It's an ordeal when you have to do it once, and so the practice tests, sometimes students need some convincing to sit down and do a practice test, but I think it's really, really valuable. We will be proctoring those. If students can't come to our proctor tests, really recommend that they get a practice test. It's full length, and sit down and try to do it in the full length of time. There's really nothing, there's no experience doing it bit by bit that's going to match the experience of doing it all together. So they need to do some timing drills. Most students struggle with timing on at least one portion of the test. Different students, like Ben was saying, they find multiple choice or free response differently difficult, but most students need to do at least a little bit of fine tuning of their timing. And doing little timing drills or taking whole tests can help with that. Looking at whole tests also help them kind of see a lot of questions and prioritize, determine units that they need to do sort of their last minute study on. In fact, often in my last session with a student, we'll try to make a list based on their last practice test. Like, here's what I want you to look over with like your morning breakfast, the morning of the test. There's like 5 facts that for whatever reason, they're just not sticking. You only need to keep them in your head for 4 hours. So look over those with your breakfast cereal and then go and take the test. I hope you remember most of the material, but if you forget those things after the test, it's fine, right? Those are our last minute. Please memorize these things. It might be a formula here, right? It might be, the definition of a word, whatever. Those are things you usually discover when you're doing practice tests, right? You do a practice test and this thing is the last thing, the last piece of the puzzle there. And then big picture, when you're taking a whole test, you start to sort of understand, where does your anxiety kick in if you have a lot of test anxiety? Where does fatigue kick in if you realize that, like, I'm getting really tired on these kind of questions? And there's different ways that students can help coach themselves through this on the test. Some students will take sort of a little like breather partway through the multiple choice. Students will approach the questions, as Ben was saying, in a different order so that they're maximizing their points. And if they have to guess on the last couple, it's okay. They've got a strategy to maximize their score. Whatever we're doing to approach that, again, really taking this practice test is the best way to identify issues and then also put into practice our solutions. Usually we don't get to do more than a couple of full-length practice tests, both because not that many exist and because most students don't have like a ton of time to do this every weekend. But taking 1 or 2 makes a huge difference. And there's some specific work we can do in that context that's hard to do without doing the whole practice test. But that's basically the way that we try to approach a prep.
All right. I know that was a lot. Thank you so much to Ben and Matt for giving us such a good overview of what we do. I think they've both been here for many years at AJ Tutoring and conducted dozens and dozens of AP preps, if not hundreds in some cases, and seen lots and lots of students. That's true of a lot of our tutors, it's one of the, I think, benefits that our students have with working with us is that they can both work with us for academic tutoring and get that sort of specific help on the AP. I know that we've basically been in this for almost an hour now. We've saved until 8:30. We don't intend to take up that much of your time, but I know that there were a few questions that came through on the registration when you filled that out that I wanted to just highlight in the next section. We may have actually covered them a little bit in this conversation already, but I wanted to pull them out especially because I know we said a lot. And again, if you missed it at the beginning, we are recording this and we will share the recording of this entire presentation in an email in the next day or two. Usually it takes a little bit for us to process it and then we'll share it. I believe everyone in here actually should get a copy of it regardless. If you have Google Meets or Google Drive, it should sort of save so that you all have access to it anyway, but we will share it more broadly afterwards. So I wanted to start with just a few sort of preloaded questions. If you have questions that you want to add to this, you can, I think, put them in the chat. I think the chat is available, but you can also use the Q&A function, which should be an option on either on the bottom or in the bottom right in the sort of triangle, square, circle activities menu. There should be a Q&A section in there for you as well. Okay, so and we'll try to kind of share the answers to these a little bit. So here are some questions that I saw that I thought, we should probably address these sort of separately and get kind of a sense. Some of them are going to have less satisfying answers, I think, than others because a lot of them are it depends, but we'll try to talk about what it depends on. So I'll field this first question. What do colleges consider a good AP score? Because we do have these conversations a lot with students. Some students come to us to prepare for an AP test. and they get a 4. And for some students, a 4 is devastating. And for some students, a 4 is incredible. And it kind of depends on what they need, right? Like that is the answer to what a good score is. If you are going to attend a college and that college says with a 4, we will give you college credit for this. This is great. We're excited to see you get a 4 in this because it's a difficult test. And we acknowledge that. And we really love, 4 or 5 is perfect. Then a 4 or 5 is perfect. It doesn't matter which one you get. They're both excellent scores in that situation. And then some colleges have more stringent requirements, and they're going to ask, for a 5 in order to get credit. And in that case, a 4 might be a little bit more disappointing. I do think that in a lot of cases, the pursuit that you plan, the study that you plan to undertake, I can't word right now, the subject you want to pursue in college is what I'm trying to say. You probably want to put a little bit more energy into those, right? We want to get a really good score in something that is then going to go into your major. If it's a little bit less related, getting a 5 may not be the most important thing. And that kind of goes back to what Matt and Ben were talking about when we were discussing prioritization. Do you have anything to add on either of you on like what a good AP score looks like?
That's pretty good. I mean, you can look it up as well. Like the percentiles that different tests have vary dramatically from test to test as far as like how many students get a 4 or 5. And I don't even know how important that is, but it's true, right? Some tests students are much more likely to get a 4 or 5. Some tests in some years just the test is hard and a lot fewer students get them. You can look that up. It's publicly released every year, but whether you even think that's relevant to determine what a good score is sort of up to you and up to what you're trying to use the score for.
Definitely. Yeah, you can. That was something I remember watching last year was on what was formerly Twitter, the College Board president just like releasing, okay, here are the percents for this one, here are the percents for this one, and people sort of responding to that as it came through. Can students send some AP scores and withhold others? I think I mentioned this. Ben and Matt, do you remember what the answer was?
Yes, usually you can. There's also, I believe it's still an option on the test. I've not heard of it being removed. At the end of the test, you can choose to not have your test graded. Is that still present?
I'll have to look that up. Actually, I'm not sure. I like there are in most cases an option at the end of a test to cancel your test.
Yes, exactly.
At any point, like you can say like, never mind. I don't want to turn this in. I'm like, please cancel it, and they'll like rip it in half in front of you to confirm.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know how that works for the digital test. I haven't seen that specifically because that's new in the last couple of years, and it's only for certain subjects in certain schools using the digital test right now. But I believe that has been true for the paper and pencil test, the more traditional version.
Right. So I think that's worth thinking about. Almost never would I utilize that option because almost always you can simply get your score and then choose not to send it.
Exactly.
But I think it's worth talking to students with sometimes because most of us, you don't want them to panic and say like, yes, let's tear it up. And no, I don't want to see it graded. And some students, that is sort of their instinct that they, when they see that on the test, like, oh, I can cancel it. So that might be a discussion to have. Like it's a possibility if, it's going to be a blank test anyway, because you just had an issue and you just couldn't do it. But usually you want to get your test graded because usually you have the choice to send in the score or not anyway. But I have known students to sort of panic and cancel their scores. I would usually not recommend it, but it is there. It is a possibility.
Yeah, I will say, like to like Ben's point earlier too, the grade that you need to get in terms of the raw percent correct is usually much lower on the AP exam than it is in a school exam. Even in a curved school exam that was graded on a curve may still require much higher percent correct. So you may feel like you're doing worse on the AP test and still be doing very well. And I think this is another reason we strongly recommend practice tests for everyone, so they can actually gauge how well they're doing and have a measure on that. Otherwise, it can be really difficult for a student to tell if they're doing poorly or not.
That's actually, just to piggyback on that.
Yeah.
Something really important about managing anxiety for students. A student who's used to scoring in a certain area, getting 90, 95% of questions correct in a test, they might notice the experience of getting something closer to a 70 or 75, which can be existentially challenging. But for the AP tests, that is almost always a 5. And so like knowing that and trusting that is really important.
Absolutely. We touched on this a little bit, and I had thought about talking about this more, and I kind of took it out because I thought it might be too tangential, but I want to mention it here. So the question is, should students take an AP exam if the school isn't currently offering the course? There are some schools in our area right now that have started to pull back on offering AP courses. They're largely private schools, but there are some public schools that have started to do this as well. There are also schools that have historically just not offered it because they offer an alternative program. Like, for example, International Baccalaureate or IB program is also an advanced coursework. It's a more all-encompassing program than AP at the moment. AP is a little more a la carte, where you can sort of pick and choose the classes you take. IB, you often have to do kind of a full course of study. And a handful of schools in our area offer IB, and you wouldn't necessarily do both. You might, but you might not necessarily. Because IB has its own sort of cumulative exams. It's a different structure. So, I didn't want to get too in the weeds on IB because this is an EP presentation. But there are some circumstances where a school may say, we're not offering the official AP course, but we think that this course is actually good preparation for an AP exam. Or I've even had students who took an AP exam a whole year after taking the course because they had, for whatever reason, they just decided that was going to be a good fit for them. I'm not really sure why. But I think that sometimes that makes sense for some students, and it's going to be a case-by-case thing. What I don't recommend is that a student sort of decide today in like an honors or a regular course that they want to attempt an AP course. I think that like you really need to get a good understanding of whether your course is preparing you at the level of rigor that an AP exam would require. Some courses that are not labeled AP can do that. And usually the teacher of that course or the counselor at your high school will have more understanding of that and will be able to advise you. If they can't, though, you can also just get a diagnostic from us. Like that diagnostic we talked about that Ben said we often do use at the beginning of a prep. We're happy to provide that to students without actually signing up for prep, just to get a sense of how they're doing. A lot of the diagnostics have multiple choice, and so we can quickly grade that. If they have free response questions, that can be a little bit more complicated. Sometimes we just have you, we give you a rubric and have you kind of decide if you're not in a tutoring session. We can't do a full report like we do with some things like SAT diagnostics. But it can give you an understanding like, okay, does what my knowledge base, map to what this test seems to be suggesting I need to know. And if it seems like a pretty good match, then it might be worth doing. One caveat to all of this, in most cases, if you haven't signed up for an EP test by now, you're not going to find one. A lot of schools have cutoffs of October and November for being able to sign up. It's not 100%, but it's going to be much harder to find an AP test if you haven't already enrolled in the AP test at this stage. With the exception of, there are some semester-long courses, like sometimes AP macroeconomics and AP microeconomics are kind of offered in a semester each. And so if it's a second semester course, it's possible that you can get in with an AP exam if you talk to the counselor. But if it's a full year course, like AP Physics 1 is a full year course, probably in most cases, I would imagine, probably not. Any other thoughts on this? Like, have you heard anything different from what I'm saying, Ben, Matthew?
No, yeah, like you're saying, yeah, it would be very difficult to sign up now. It'd be very difficult to start preparing now. I think you're looking at next year and your school doesn't offer an AP, but you want to take the AP test, that's much more doable. If you know from the beginning that that's the plan. I think the reason that the College Board has pushed for more of an October, November cutoff is because they find students do better if they are committed to the test earlier in the year. And that can absolutely work well. But it is usually something that requires like you intended to do this from the beginning and took some initial steps.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I would say that preparing for an AP test mostly should not be about learning new content. It should be about learning how to leverage the content that you already know and understand. There's definitely room for some fine tuning, for some like getting something to click that didn't click before. But it would be, just a totally different experience to try to like actually prepare for an AP test starting now if you are not taking the class. And so I just from a time management standpoint, I would not recommend it.
Yeah, I think in most cases, that's definitely true. And that kind of actually goes well with the last question there, Ben. If my student is already receiving academic tutoring for an AP course, like at AJ Tutoring, do they still need to sign up for AP test prep, or are they getting AP tutoring already? Like, what is the difference? We kind of touched on this a little bit, but I want to help highlight this for people in case you do have a student who's getting academic tutoring with us for their AP class. Like, what are they getting in that tutoring session that is helping with the AP test, and what are they getting that maybe is not there, that they may benefit from taking this sort of separate AP test prep short course that we discussed. Ben, do you want to kind of like talk about what that's like for AP physics? Like, I think you kind of right there, like what the difference is, but maybe just to drive it home there for us.
Absolutely. So academic tutoring is mostly focused on helping a student engage better with their class, better understand the material as it's being presented in the class, and stay on top of preparing for tests and making sure that they understand the material well enough to do the homework. So it's mostly about supporting the student with what their class is already doing. So if the class is like really doing its own AP stuff and is super focused, you wouldn't necessarily need very much additional test preparation tutoring. Even then, we know it would be good to do a couple of test preparation sessions, just because then we can provide materials that we've made that can really help a student get some extra practice in, focus in on specific areas of review. But if the class is providing its own AP materials, a tutor can review those materials in academic tutoring, anything that's provided by a class that's academic. If a class is coming down to the wire and is still doing new material in April, if a class doesn't do very AP focused tests on its own, doesn't have AP sort of thought processes built in already, then a tutor will probably be recommending right around now that we should start talking about scheduling some additional time together to really make sure that everything you've been working on can be aligned with the AP test itself. And instead of helping prepare for in addition to helping prepare for class tests, also helping getting used to the AP format, AP questions, and how they're the same, but also particularly the ways in which they're different in predictable ways that we want to make sure that we're familiar with.
Yeah, any other kind of anecdotal evidence from your own practice, Matt?
Just that your tutor, if you were receiving academic tutoring, at least from us, your tutor is probably going to have a pretty good idea. This is a pretty easy transition. I think if the tutor knows your student really well and has already been working with you for a semester, they're going to have a pretty good idea. They'll probably still give you the diagnostic, but they'll usually have a pretty good idea of what that AP prep needs to look like, how long it needs to be, and they probably have already been like mentally telling what they're going to go back and cover. So all of our tutors are going to be familiar with the test. They've looked at the practice materials. They know what they're looking at, and so that's usually where I'd start the conversation, is with the tutor themselves on that topic. They'll have a lot more insight than just one of us could have.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I'll say, in my own practice, doing academic tutoring with calculus students in the South Bay, there are a lot of schools that provide quite a bit of preparation time for the calculus classes, and they're getting good preparation at their schools. I think there are a handful of things that we can do a little bit better in a dedicated AP prep as one-on-one tutors. I think namely the practice test review is just a little bit more thorough. I can sit with your student and talk just about his or her test and not have to worry about sort of providing blanket statements. I can look at the free response questions and say, okay, this is why you got this score. Like, let me show you how you wrote this and how you should have written it to get the full credit. just a little bit extra. But, you know, having said that, it means that I probably don't need to do, you know, 8 to 10 sessions with that student. I could probably do it in 2 or 3 sessions and really feel very confident that they're where they need to be in most cases, as long as all of the content, like we said, is there, and they're doing well in the course in general. But it really does vary. Like, you know, Matt was saying that I think similarly, I have students who are currently in, well, I don't want to badmouth any schools, but sometimes history classes get behind. We'll just say that. and
It's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of history, and there's more every year.
Exactly. You're trying to make sure you're not leaving anybody behind, and eventually, you know, suddenly you're there, and it's May, and we have to get ready. And so I do think like it varies not only by school, but by course, by how the tutor student interaction has been going. You know, have we been meeting regularly all year? Did we just start a couple of months ago? You know, how much investigation do we need to do to figure out what your student needs in order to do the best that they can, and what is their goal for the AP test and all of that. So I will say, you know, if you have specific questions about how your student will do on an AP test and what you think, what we think that your student will need, like definitely reach out to us or your tutor. If you have a tutor already, they should have good insights into this. I want to open this up now. Like I said, we've saved time until 8:30, but we don't want to force anybody to stay too long. I know it's already, you know, it's Wednesday, it's the middle of the week. Everybody's probably a little bit tired, I know. And so if you've got additional questions that you want to ask in this setting, please do. I think, again, like the chat may be open as far as I could tell. It looks like I've checked the right box to make sure everybody can send a message. And we also have a Q&A option in the activities, which should be something that you can find. So we'll wait around for about 5 or 10 minutes to see if anybody has additional questions. But let me just kind of say thank you so much for coming. If you need to get going, we totally are okay with that. You can reach out to us at any of these contacts. You can also just reach out to AJ Tutoring generally. We have a fantastic group of client services directors that can help you get started if you're not really sure where to start. And you can reach them at info@ajtutoring.com or our main line, 650-331-3251. You can see on the phone numbers that Ben and I have slightly different numbers because we're trying to highlight the regions that where we tutor. But actually, the 650 number will reach us as well. You don't have to worry. They all go to the same place. It's just a way to make it a little bit easier for you to find us. Thank you again so much for coming. If you came, we really appreciate you sticking it out for the end. And we'll stick around for about 5 or 10 more minutes and take any questions if you have them. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.